Alright, so welcome to part two of deconstructing the myth of that bagpipes were banned in Ireland and Scotland. Um, yeah, you know what? It's a complex topic, and there's lots of layers to it, layers of history and folklore and mythology and all that sort of culture. And so, to give you a much deeper sense of background and where all this comes from, if you'd watched my video, it's bit nearly an hour long. It's about 50 minutes long. Like part one of this, the myth of the ban on the bagpipe. The link is just below there. Um, I'd say it's important to do that to get to get the historical and cultural context of where this myth comes from, like why it's there in the first place, what brought us to think this. Essentially, if you haven't watched the first part of the video or of this talk, what I'm doing here is I'm dealing with the myth that says that basically bagpipes were banned in Ireland and Scotland, and the origins of those bans are what's consistently cited as being the proof of those bans is, first of all, in Ireland's case, it's the Statutes of Kilkenny from 1367. And in Scotland's case, it's the Disarming Act of 1715, which came into effect in 1716. Then in 1725, there was a new act, the Disarming of the Highlands. Then in 1746, there was the Act of Prescription and also the Dress Act. And then famously, their example is the execution of the piper James Reid. So between all these sources, this is where this myth that bagpipes are banned is coming from, and it's getting stronger since the internet came out. It's just perpetuated all over the internet. I grew up believing that as well from a cultural point of view. Before the internet came about, like 20 years ago, I believed it. And I just think it's really important anyway to get back to the facts, to check these sources, to see what they actually say. And that's what I'm going to do in this video here in part two. So as I say, if you want to get the background of the myth, like why this myth is there, like please do watch part one, because it's a good introduction to part two of this. Gives you a good lot of sort of historic background to get your head around, and propaganda, and I don't know, like it is a bit political, and I don't like getting political because I do always say this: I've no agenda, I've no axe to grind, and I'm not politically minded. I've had my mind changed so many times, like by looking at so many different sources. So I can't be political. Like I just find everything just changes too much, and there's too many people with sort of agendas. And I think, unfortunately, that this is one of the agendas that's being pushed on the instrument, used as a historical kind of, I don't know, a historical kind of wedge sometimes, or prop to kind of to put forward a certain opinion that unfortunately always basically says that it's all England's fault, everything is the British fault and the English's fault, and it's a real sort of fuck them. Sorry for cursing, but that's the attitude and the agenda that's been put across all the time. And I'm sure as a piper, you come across that as well, and you probably have believed a lot of it yourself, like I did. But as I say, I've dealt with all that in part one. Right, so part two is let's look at these acts, let's look at these laws. It's not going to be boring. I know that reading through laws and acts and all that might sound really boring, but I'm not going to do that. I've done all of that. I've sifted through all the boring shit, and I've gotten to the points that actually matter in the text. So let's get to those points. Without further ado, we'll jump into these texts and we'll discuss it and pull it apart as it's happening, as I'm reading it out. Okay, so now, the earliest references to these incidents of bagpipes being banned in Ireland were now in the Statutes of Kilkenny from 1367. Oh, and just one last thing before, I just want to say this just before I pull all these acts and laws apart. Sorry. what you're going to notice, and my conclusion, I'll just tell you how the conclusion that's going to be at the end, right? What you're going to notice about all of these things is that only in a certain specific circumstances, right, is the instrument or slash piper banned or arrested or executed or confiscated or whatever, right? And that one circumstance that this happens in is when you're actually caught red-handed, caught in the open air of act of defiance or actually caught in a fight, caught in a battle, caught actually like using your pipes, yourself using them as an instrument of war. That's the only time that these things are ever banned. There's no like blanket ban. For a start off, there's no blanket ban, right? I'm just going to tell you this from the start, right? Only in very specific circumstances are either the piper or the bagpipes or whatever, what's called prescripted. That it's like basically you're caught red-handed in the middle of a fight with you're playing your bagpipes and you're on the side that, you know, that's going against the law or the status quo or whatever like that. That's when it's considered. That's the only time that they're ever taken off you or banned or whatever like that. It's not, these bans aren't just general bans on everybody. It's only, as I say, in the middle of being caught in the act that this happens. It's like real simple analogy. It's like, you know, right, if you have a scissors, like, you know, a scissors isn't banned. A scissors isn't against the law. It's fine to use a scissors in your workplace or at home or whatever. But as soon as you take up that scissors and you use it as a dagger or a knife and you stab someone with it, well then what's going to happen? The scissors is taken off you, it's confiscated, and the scissors is considered a weapon. So it's only when you're caught doing the wrong thing, that's when the instrument that you're using is considered like this. But scissors was never banned in Ireland, were they? Or they were never banned anywhere else. So that's just a little analogy of it. So anyway, you'll find that's the common thing that runs through all of this. It's only when someone's caught red-handed, basically. Right, so anyway, let's get back to it. Right, we're in 1367 now. Article 15 of the Statute of Kilkenny. Now, also, whereas the Irish agents who come among the English spy out the secrets, plans, and policies of the English, whereby great evils have often resulted, it is agreed and forbidden that any Irish agents, that is to say, pipers, storytellers, babblers, rhymers, mowers, nor any of the Irish agent shall come among the English, and that no English shall receive or make gift to such, and that shall do and be attained shall be taken and imprisoned, as well as the Irish agents as the English who receive or give them anything, and after that they shall make fine at the King's will, and the instruments of their agency shall forfeit to our Lord the King. Right, so that just seems very, very clear and simple. In a specific set of circumstances where Irish agents who come among the English spy out their secrets, plans and policies of the English, whereby great evils have often resulted. So what does that mean? That means that if basically there's Irish agents, like they say, like pipers, storytellers, rhymers, if they're going among the English, right, in other words, if they're infiltrating the English, see, don't forget, in 1367, you had what were called the English areas, which were like the Pale around Dublin and places like Kilkenny, some cities like where like English customs were in vogue and English laws were in vogue. The rest of the country was Gaelic and or else you had the Norman sort of families as well. Um, the old English they were called, like they were here since the 1100s. And they were kind of halves and halves. That's the best way to put them. They were of Norman extraction and origin, but they were loyal to the King of England, but they had been in the country 200 years, almost 300 years at this stage, and they had mixed and intermingled with Irish, and they had taken on Irish customs and stuff like that. So um, this is the sort of more English, right? So it's only when the Irish agents who come among the English and spy out the secrets, plans, and policies of the English, such as pipers, blah blah blah. That's the problem. It's only when you're there to spy on them. So it's not saying that bagpipes across Ireland are banned as an instrument of war. Nowhere near does it say that. It's only it's saying that basically if you've got like, and this used to happen all the time. This used to happen in England as well. Like where minstrels like this is well known and well documented that like court jesters and minstrels and people who are there to entertain the Lord, whoever he was, could be spies basically. Like they're able to hear all what's going on. They're overhearing conversations. They're listening to things. They're supposed to be innocent sort of bystanders. They're not. Like they could run off then and tell the rival lord or baron something. This happened in England. This happened everywhere. This wasn't just in Ireland. This happened everywhere. That these court entertainers and minstrels used to spy on what was going on. So they didn't want anyone earwigging into the plans or policies or whatever like that. So that's the context of this thing. It's just when they're being used to spy out. Literally, I'm gonna quote: spy out secrets, plans, and policies, whereby great evils have often resulted. So this is being known to happen. So it's forbidden. It's forbidden that any of these lads, like and pipers among that, it's storytellers, rhymers. It's forbidden that they shall come among the English, right? So for the purpose of spying, right, they shouldn't come among the English, and that no English should make our gift to such. So you shouldn't be paying them. And that shall do so and be attained shall be taken and imprisoned. So the punishment is take them and imprison them, as well the Irish agents as the English who receive or give them anything. So, you know, if you've got like Irish agents who are using minstrels, pipers, right, for the act of spying out secrets, plans, and policies, they'll be fined and the instruments will be forfeit to the king. So it seems very, very clear to me there that's what's happening. It's only if you go there to spy out secrets and plans, and you're under the guise of a piper. Doesn't say anywhere that bans bagpipes out across the whole country. I'll just read it once more. I'll stop waffling. Just listen to the words and tell me what you think in the comments below. I'll just read it once more. Also, whereas the Irish agents who come among the English spy out their secrets, plans, and policies of the English, whereby great evils have often resulted, it is agreed and forbidden that any Irish agents, that is to say, pipers, storytellers, babblers, rhymers, mowers, nor any other Irish agent, shall come among the English, and that no English shall receive or make gift to such, and that shall do so and be attained shall be taken and imprisoned, as well the Irish agents as the English who receive or give them anything, and after that they shall make fine at the king's will, and the instruments of their agency shall forfeit to our Lord the King. So as you can see there, it's a certain specific circumstance. It says nothing about banning bagpipes across Ireland, or doesn't say anything about if someone peasants down the road are having a party and there's some lad sitting playing his bagpipe, you have to get him, or it doesn't say any of that. It's only in this actual circumstance where you've got musicians that are going to be spying out secrets and plans and policies and moving from one place to the other, telling them to the next person. You can see that's, I mean, that's a sort of an obvious one. And it doesn't apply to everyone, because it says, as well the Irish agents as the English who receive or give them anything. That's Irish agents as the English. That doesn't mean, like, to be an Irish agent doesn't mean every Irish person in the whole country. It means, like, those Irish, we'll say, that are in favour with the English, or who are cooperating with them, or who are getting along with them, they're agents. I mean, it means like agents of the crown, or you're part of the system or whatever. So it's not just, this law just doesn't apply to English people who are employing them. It would apply also to Irish people who are employing them in that capacity, like Irish people of importance, Irish agents. That doesn't mean every Tom, Dick and Harry in Ireland. Not every Irish person was an agent. So it's just in that specific circumstance of they didn't want musicians or entertainers spying on their business and passing it on to the next person. In that case, they're banned and they shouldn't be supported. And I think if you can extrapolate from that, that's the one article that says about it in Ireland. If you can extrapolate it from that this is the attempt to ban bagpipes across the whole country, that's just wrong. It's a bit of a step. It's a bit of a huge, massive step into of something so specific and detailed that this. If you can read out of that bans bagpiping in the whole of Ireland, well, I'm sorry, I don't see it. And if that's the case, right, well then why did Henry VIII employ Irish pipers? Well, first of all, these laws weren't really adhered to, or they weren't all that successful. That's one thing. And the second thing is that the piper in that specific circumstance as being a private entertainer for agents, English agents and Irish agents, that's all it means, right? If there was a whole nationwide ban on pipers, right, then there wouldn't have been any pipers, because it would have, like, okay, you know, first of all, the law was ignored anyway, largely. But second of all, that law couldn't have applied to the rest of the whole country. And it was only for that circumstance because the King of England himself, Henry VIII, employed Irish pipers going into battle. Now, that's not to say that he had them as private entertainers. He wasn't supposed to. If he was sticking to the statutes of Kilkenny, he wasn't supposed to have. Now, the statutes of Kilkenny were like 200 years roughly before him, right? So they were probably a distant memory by that stage. But do you not see the irony in this? Is that, like, if he was to adhere to the statutes of Kilkenny, he wasn't supposed to have them as private entertainers at court because they could be spies. That's understandable. But he'd no problem using them going into battle. So it says, I have an article here, the first clear references to the Irish Pib War relate to Henry VIII's siege of Boulogne, if I'm pronouncing that right, Boulogne, a muster roll of the cairn to be transported into England to serve the king. So these are to be transported, they're to be gathered up in Ireland and transported into England to serve the king. Contains entries of various pipers attached to these forces. For example, the Baron of Delvine's cairn, there was Brian McIntyre, the piper. Right, so they were specifically sought out in Ireland to go and fight in England for Henry VIII. According to an entry in Holinshed's Chronicles from 1577, for May back in 1544, in the same month also passed through the city of London in warlike manner to the number of 700 Irish men, having for their weapons darts and handguns with bagpipes before them. And in St James's Park beside Westminster, they mustered before the king. Right, so much for the Statute of Kilkenny for a start, that it tried to ban bagpipes all over Ireland. It wasn't, I'll keep repeating, it was just for specific circumstances for court entertainers. And there you go, there's the King of England actually having pipers and lads, fighters, shipped over and passed through the city of London, 700 Irish men carrying darts, like spears, handguns and bagpipes before them. I thought you said they tried to ban it. And sticking in Ireland through history, okay, let's get up to the late 1600s, okay. The pipes seem to have figured prominently in the war with William of Orange, okay, when they exiled King James II, right? So King James II is the exiled king, the Jacobite king. When he arrived in Cork City. Now, don't forget, he's not just the King of Scotland, he's the king of everywhere. He's the King of Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales. And there's a civil war going on. I'm not going to go all on about now the Battle of the Boyne, right? But just this is putting into context of it. When King James arrived in Cork City in 1689, he was greeted with bagpipes and dancing, throwing their mantles under his horse's feet. And on his way into so that was down in Cork. And then on his way to the castle in Dublin, the pipers of the several companies played the tune, "The King Enjoys His Own Again." I mean, if that does... So these are British monarchs that pipers are going out and fighting for and playing to entertain and to welcome, both down in Cork and in Dublin. Any sign of any ban on bagpipers there? No, don't think so. What's also of note, and it's really worth mentioning as well, coming from those times, right? So we're in the 15 and 1600s now. I don't want to pass over this. I don't want to go into it in way too much detail because there's just too many names and all of that sort of thing. But basically, it's state pardons granted to pipers. So here's just an example, like state pardons from the state that were granted to pipers between 1550 and 1585. Right, so these are like, the English law or whatever in the English system of governance. This isn't the Gaelic thing. This is the English way, and they're pardoning pipers. So you have Hugh Bui, the piper, Cormac the piper, William the piper, John O'Doran of Britis. That's really interesting because don't forget the Dorans were great travelling uilleann pipers. And his name is John and all. That's mad. So John O'Doran of Britis in County Wicklow, at the request of the Protestant Archbishop of Dublin. So this is between 1550 and 1585. The Protestant Archbishop of Dublin asked for John O'Doran to be pardoned. Murray on Peebre, Murray the piper. There were gentlemen pipers even in those days, it seemed. For this man, his address was the Park near Gorey in Wexford, who was one of the parties to a treaty with the then Lord Deputy of Ireland in relation to their estates. So this lad Murray the piper was one of the party to a treaty with the Lord Deputy of Ireland in relation to their estates. So they had estates. So he was a piper. This lad had an estate. Goes on and names them: Connolly McFinnan, Manus the piper, Thomas McShane, Brian Fitzpatrick, Conor McLaughlin, Owen the piper, Thomas Ray or Brown from the King's County, Morgan the piper. The date of this pardon was in 1584, although he was previously pardoned in 1574. So this lad got pardoned twice. He got pardoned in 1574 and then he was pardoned again in 1584, 10 years later. Alexander the piper from Park, Gorey, County Wexford, Donna Casey, Donna McCormick from County Limerick. Here's an interesting fella, John Pearce, the chief musician and piper to Sir Gerald Fitzgerald. So there's a Norman name, Fitzgerald. in the late 1500s of Drummana. Um, so it just goes on to say another little bit. Another batch of pardons to pipers is recorded in the state papers from 1601 to 1603. Both inclusive and from the large number so liberated, so these were all liberated and pardoned, we can readily conceive how active in the national cause were the Irish pipers at the period, although it appears that they were more in their glory half a century later. So in the mid 1600s, the Peigh-Boir or Irish warpipe continued in favour wherever the Irish engaged in battle, and the brave pipers always led on the army in times of warfare. So these pipers were leading armies in Ireland. They were, yes, they were, but they were pardoned, right? Why were they pardoned? If this ban was going to be so much enforced, where it wasn't even a ban in the first place, because why? Because the Statutes of Kilkenny is the only reference to it, and it's only for certain particular circumstances if they're actually spying on somebody, right? So, and the Irish were used, the pipers were used by the kings of England as well. So it just, obviously the pipes weren't banned. But what's crucial about all this stuff is that all these lads were pardoned. Like, they were pardoned. And so the only times that I can figure out if that pipers are actually getting arrested, it seems to me that they're only getting arrested when, in inverted commas, they're caught piping on the wrong side of the matter. I've just shown you there the English King Henry VIII, King James actually employed pipers themselves. So don't forget, these are years where there's all sorts of turmoil that's happening in both countries. Like, you know, there's all sorts of power struggles and all that going on within England, Scotland, Ireland. You know, there's power struggles happening, and there's lads basically going around with private armies. And it occurs to me that, like I said in the beginning, the only time that the bagpiper or the piper or the pipes is banned or arrested or whatever like that, or imprisoned or his pipes confiscated, is that if he's caught, like, basically, yeah, being on the wrong side of it's not that this is a law that, like, stops everyone from doing it in every circumstance. So there's a good example here. It says, it says John Cullinan, even as late as 1676, John Cullinan was prosecuted. Now this says for being a bagpiper, right? But let's look at that closely. 1676, John Cullinan was prosecuted for being a bagpiper. The specific complaint was that when the company of soldiers went to the parish church at Ringaround, County Cork, he went piping ahead of them to the church. Right. So in 1676, what was he doing in Ireland? What were these soldiers doing in 1676? Like, whose side were they on? Because don't forget, just as I read out there, only a few years later, in 1689, when King James arrived into Cork, he was greeted with bagpipers and dancing, and then the same again up in Dublin. So what's happening here is that these lads are caught red-handed at basically in the mid, being with an army or being with a gang of armed men or a group of soldiers. That's the problem. The problem isn't that they'd have been arrested anyway. If they were with those lads, they'd have been arrested. The fact that they're the piper really doesn't make much of a difference, except that they're leading these lads. So they are part of an armed group. They would have got arrested if they had been playing the banjo, Now I know there wasn't banjos then, but I'm just saying, like they might have been playing a bugle and they would have got arrested. It's only when you've got these groups of lads that are going around in armed groups and there's a piper with them, then they get arrested or whatever if they're on the wrong side. But if they're not on the wrong side, they're actually employed by the king. So this idea of a blanket ban is just shy. It's bullshit. Um, and here's another example of a lad being let off, right? Um, Two lads, Cosney and Dunne, the official records to the effect that the above named pipers were brought to account in 1661. They were brought to account for piping before a corpse to the church, right? But guess what? They were let off. They were pardoned. So what's the problem? That doesn't say to me that they were brought to account for piping before a corpse to a church, but they were pardoned, they were let off. So like someone takes you to court for something and then you get let off for it, there's no problem. And then it just goes on to say that it reminds us that the bagpipe, whether in its primitive or improved form, was up until comparatively recent times associated with every Irish custom and ceremony from the cradle to the grave. That kind of sums it all up. They're played at every occasion. There was not a blanket ban on bagpipers or pipes themselves, the instrument. They were only ever singled out when they were used in circumstances that could be seen as either spying or being in the middle of some big group of armed men. And then you would have got arrested anyway for doing that, whether you had a bagpipe with you or not. So I think in the case of Ireland, it's and by the very fact even that the English monarchs are employing bagpipers in their own employ and they're happy to use them. That statute of Kilkenny is very specific, and as I say, it appears to me that you're only actually arrested for something that you would have got arrested for anyway. And it's also really says a lot that all these big long lists of pipers in the 15 and 1600s were actually pardoned and released. So they were even let off with their so-called crime. And you might say, well, how was it a crime in the first place? But I'm just after addressing that. It's only a crime when you're caught with a big group of armed men. Or you're doing something that's sort of against the law or whatever, like that spying or whatever it is, or you're being part of something. So this idea that like bagpipes are banned is obviously bullshit, because so many lads were pardoned for it. It only applies when you're caught in the act of doing something wrong, you know. And the very fact that the kings of England were using Irish pipers through these years themselves. So in that case, the pipers were on the right side, if you want to look at it that way. Like you know, depending on your outlook of what's right and wrong or whatever like that. It just goes back to the thing of the scissors. You can use the scissors, just don't stab somebody with it. Don't be on the wrong side of the law with it. It's that simple. It's not that the bagpipe itself was the problem. So don't forget too as well, you know, to be on the wrong side of the law in those times was very easy. Like it's not not just a simple case of, you know, it's England versus Ireland. It's ridiculous. Like these were the 1600s were terrible tumultuous times on both of these islands. There were civil wars going on. Civil wars going on over monarchies and, you know, religion and everything else on both islands, throughout Scotland, throughout England, throughout Ireland. And there were lads going around with private armies. There were, you know, supporters of the king. There was supporters of Parliament. It wasn't even a straight cut like Catholic Protestant conflict either. The 1600s is a terrible mixed up time of suffering and killing on both of these islands. It's not just a simple thing of it's the English versus the Irish. There were civil wars going on within Scotland, within England, on the island of Britain. There was that the 1600s is a terrible, vicious, and the English Civil War is going on. Like, and that overflowed into Ireland. Like the Irish took sides. Sometimes, mostly actually they took the side of the king, and then it's very, very complex. Um, it's not like most normal people anyway had any choice in the matter, like that they could opt out of it. Like most common or poor people just ended up in the middle of all these things. So it's easy to fall on the wrong side of with the law, like depending on who's in charge. You know, like I find it interesting that it's like Cromwell was in Ireland. Like he was in Ireland like for a year, like between 1649 and 1650. But what people forget about there, Irish people forget about, is that it was part of the what was called like the War of the Three Kingdoms. Um, like there was an Irish rebellion in 1641 where most of Ireland came under the control of Irish Catholics, the Irish Catholic Confederation, um, who basically were royalists, and they were supporters of the king, and but th- they got defeated. Like don't forget, like there was like Cromwell and his parliament, um, the Cromwell and the parliamentarians, fighting against the king for effectively what was actually an early version of a republic in England. Um, but religion had got to do with that as well because he was a strict like um, Puritan, which is sort of close to Calvinist and Presbyterian, um, which is totally different to the Church of England, which we all know came from Henry VIII wanting to remarry. But the Church of England was actually more Catholic than it was Puritan. Um, Even that is complicated in itself. The different forms of Protestantism that didn't agree with each other. So there's a civil war going on up and down Britain, and generally the Irish Catholic Confederation, the leaders throughout the 1600s sided with the king because he would have been, I suppose, easier on Catholics. So it's part of a greater thing. This is all part of the English Civil War, and as we know, um, Cromwell won, and he executed the king, King Charles, and he was severe on everyone. Like that, that was um, like he was severe on the English people too, like that had supported the king and whatever else. So it's all a big messed up. The 1600s is a very messed up, bloody period. It's no way as simple as just this is England versus Ireland. It's not as simple as that at all. And so what I'm trying to put out there is that you've got different groups of Irish fighting men and Scottish fighting men. And traditionally they had been led by pipers and they're playing pipers. So depending on what group you're fighting with, you're either on the right side or the wrong side. You're either with the law or you're against the law, depending on who's in charge. And then don't forget, as we all know, Cromwell reigned until 1660. And then we all know that it was after that the king was restored, Charles II was restored, and the English people dug up Cromwell themselves and hung him out of a tree, as far as I know. So it was a very, very mixed up, bloody, terrible time on both islands, depending on what side it didn't matter what your nationality was. It was, but Cromwell like wreaked. It was a terrible period in Irish history. So it was just as terrible in English history or Scottish history as well. Like it did, you just it's just, your sense of nationalism wasn't anything. It didn't mean anything to them. It was just about whether you supported the king or the parliament. And most common people just sort of fought for whoever was the local leader around the area at the time, or what they thought that they'd get out of it for the best. Um, so I just think it's interesting that, the King Charles was restored to in 1660. And then the pipers are still used then, like later on in the century, like I described there, before around the time of the Battle of the Boyne and that, So to just summarise all of this in Ireland, like it just basically bagpipes just weren't banned. It's not as simple as that. It's only in specific circumstances, when you're caught basically in a fight and you're on the wrong side, but then you'd been sentenced anyway because you were on the wrong side. You got caught. It didn't really matter that you had a bagpipe. It's just that it was significant because you were kind of really leading people in battle. That's the whole thing of it. But you'd have been with them anyway. So you'd have got arrested anyway. It's not that you were... The crime wasn't that you were playing a bagpipe. The crime was that you were on the wrong side in a really mixed up, turbulent time. It was very, very easy to be on the wrong side of the law. No matter who you were, no matter what side you were on, no matter what your religious faith was, it was such a century of bloodshed across the two islands that for anyone to just summarise this as just being it's Ireland versus England is just totally way out, totally overly simplistic. It's never that simple. So all these groups of like fighting men relative to Ireland, like, they were either fighting for the king and playing their bagpipes for the king with other, fighting men, or, were they playing for Cromwell and playing the bagpipes for Cromwell's fighting men? It's just, this was inescapable. Or were you just caught up in the middle of this whole mess and you were just sort of going along with whatever sort of everyone else was doing? But the crime wasn't that you were playing your bagpipes. The crime was that you were on the wrong side of a civil war that involved Scotland, England and Ireland and the Welsh people as well, whatever sides that they had taken. The crime isn't you played your bagpipes. Alright, so just to summarise all that, to sum it all up, right, to say that the bagpipes were banned in Ireland, or they tried to ban the bagpipes in Ireland, just looking at the Statute of Kilkenny is an absolute joke. Right, it's not. I've gone on about it so long now. Right, that was not a blanket ban on bagpipes in Ireland. And then to look at the 1500s and the 1600s, you had 2 centuries of like utmost tumultuous change and turmoil in Ireland and on the island of Britain, right? So it's a strange one, because even like in the 1500s, and I've talked about, being like, if for people who still believe in the ban, like you're saying, yeah, well, like you got arrested for being on the wrong side. So what is the wrong side? Like if they still keep simplifying it down as the English versus the Irish, so that's, the wrong side. Like that's another load of bollocks, right? To put it that simple. You can't say that this is the wrong side, because, and those 2 centuries, we need to kind of deal with them separately, because there's 2 different things going on in Ireland. Throughout the 1500s, there's a collapse in the Gaelic system of doing things, right? And you have this new English system that's coming in, and some of the Irish are going along with it. They're cooperating with it because they stood to benefit out of it. And there's others that resisted it for all sorts of reasons, okay? So if you got caught on the wrong side in the 1500s, right, both sides are using pipers. So if you're coming from the, the Gaelic kind of rebellious sides, now I'm on about now the 1500s, right? The 1600s is a total different set of circumstances. So in the 1500s, even if we do want to simplify it down as two sides, say the Gaelic world and the New World, or the English world, right? Which, by the way, half of Ireland was cooperating with anyway, right? So, and it's not always because they were forced to, it's because sometimes they actually saw the benefits of a different system. Like, we need to look at that as well. Like, the Gaelic system wasn't all this romantic system where everyone's grand, and it's kind of like this kind of, we always have this image of like the Native American Indians were all like happy and peaceful and being in touch with nature and all this, like, and Ireland was the same thing and all that, until the cruel English came along and like changed everything and robbed everyone and all that sort of stuff. It wasn't nice being part of Gaelic Ireland either. Like, there was no democratic republics back then. Not everyone had it. Not everyone had their say. They even had slaves, for fuck's sake. The Irish had slaves. We kept slaves of our own, like Irish slaves, basically, in the Gaelic system. And it was a very structured system. It was very hierarchical. Like, you had to, be loyal to your chief and all of that, and in earlier times, to a local king and all that sort of stuff. So some people actually benefited better out of going to a town. Like, if you were born in the lower orders of society in Gaelic Ireland, and it did have a structure of hierarchy. I wouldn't quite say exactly like the caste system in India, but it did have its upper echelons and its lower echelons of society. And if you were born into the lower thing, you'd know vote, and you'd know sort of say, democratic say. You could probably never really better yourself. And so maybe an opportunity was better for you if you lived on the coast and you just wanted to be, say, a fisherman and do your bit of fishing and go into the town and sell it and all that, right? That's grand. Or if you wanted to be like, go into the town or the city and be a farmer, be a tradesman, be a craftsman, you might have benefited better than you would have done if you had stayed being subservient to your Gaelic lord. That's just the reality of it. Like, Gaelic times were always glorified as if they were this perfect time. So it wasn't always that way. You might be able to benefit yourself better if you, as I say, went to a town which was under like English law, alright? So lots of Irish lords and chieftains, even in the 1500s, were already cooperating with the new system. And there's something here that I really want to stress as well. I forgot to mention it earlier on when I was talking about like the Norman invasion was really an invitation into Ireland, right? This is so important. The idea of kingship. And people are saying, what happened to the like Irish kings? Why did we have to be looking to England all the time to see what the king was doing and what the king was saying? Right. I'll just try and make this really, really simple, right? Remember I was saying about when Dermot MacMurray came in, Dermot MacMurray invited, actually they were Welsh Normans, they weren't even English. They were Welsh Normans because the King of Leinster, that was Dermot MacMurray, had a fallout with the High King of Ireland over a woman, and the High King was confiscating his kingdom off him, and not just him, his family as well, was being destroyed all over this argument. So Dermot MacMurray went over to Wales in about 60 miles away, brought over the Welsh barons who cooperated with him, and he won back his kingdom. And other Irish lords cooperated with the Welsh as well, and done deals of their own, and they ended up what ended up happening though was that the Norman barons were more powerful. They grew very powerful on their own terms and under their own steam. That the Irish, well, I mean, Dermot MacMurray, he died a few years later anyway. So but what he'd done was he'd promised his daughter's hand in marriage, Aoife, to Strongbow, or Richard de Clare. So in his own way, he was protecting his own family because his own blood was still going to be royal blood in Leinster. And that is what happened. Strongbow married Aoife and he took over essentially the kingship of Leinster in that respect. But what you also need to remember there is that there were other powerful Norman barons that actually were waging war on native Irish. Like that, sometimes the Irish would use them and cooperate with them against an enemy, and then they'd kind of both benefit out of it. But sometimes it was just a general land grab. And the whole irony of it is that when the Irish or whatever they'd no real control over what the Norman barons were doing. So the whole irony of this is that it was the last Irish High King, like Rory O'Connor, actually went to King Henry II of England and asked him for support to stop the Normans back in Ireland. So he actually went over to the English king, to stop the rampaging and the ravishing of Ireland. And then that suited the English king as well, because he didn't want some of his own barons and lords and all that setting up an independent kingdom of their own in Ireland. He wanted to keep them in control as well. So it suited them both. So the last Irish king went over to negotiate with King Henry and ask him for support, and he willingly submitted to him, to King Henry II. And that was the last Irish High King. He willingly submitted to King Henry II because they needed to restore like peace, law and order, whatever, in Ireland, and to stop these Norman barons, marauding around Ireland, cutting it up for themselves through their own thing. So King Henry II actually put his foot down, and he took up the offer from Rory O'Connor, and he accepted, and he took basically the kingship of Ireland. He was offered it. The last Irish High King willingly submitted to Henry, and ever after that, the monarch of Britain became the monarch of Ireland. The Irish kings done themselves out of it. It's like everything. Like they just fight among themselves all the time. The Irish, they never put on the united front in anything. And eventually, like it was like later on, as I said, like up in the late 1700s, like the Irish Parliament like voted itself out of existence. In the Act of Union, and you might even compare that to today. In more recent times, like the Irish Parliament, like completely voted for the European Union and the European Parliament that tell us everything now. They make all our own laws for us now. Like we voted ourselves out of existence yet again. Like with only 100, like we're supposed to be celebrating 100 years of independence from British rule, and all we've done is we've replaced Westminster with Brussels, and we've replaced sterling for the euro. So history just actually does keep repeating itself. I know, like everyone says, you should learn from history so you can't repeat yourself, but it just keeps happening like that. So what has that got to do with bagpipes, right? Well, in the 1500s, some of the Gaelic lords were cooperating with the new system, or the English system, and that system was called surrender and regrant. So what it was you'd surrender your Gaelic title as, like Ree whatever, or Taoiseach whatever. Like Taoiseach just means chieftain, Ree means a king. And you'd surrender the Gaelic title, and then it was re-granted to you back as a British title. So O'Neill was a classic example of that, like the classic, the archetypal, classic Gaelic Irish hero. He was forever doing it. He was forever like sometimes he'd be like on Queen Elizabeth's side, and then he'd do a boo and he'd break the arrangement or whatever like that, and he'd start doing his own thing again, and he'd fall out of favour with the crown. and then he'd go over and apologise, and then it's like, alright, I want to fall back in favour again, and then she forgives him and all this shit. Like, it was all politics and games, and like I say, it was like something out of these mafia groups and gangs and stuff like that. Everyone's just out for themselves. And so sometimes O'Neill played the Gaelic card, and sometimes he played the English card. He did both. When it suited him against his enemies, he used the English, and they used him. And then when it suited him, he fought them and like used his Irish like allies, or used his Irish people. And I want to just say something as well. Everyone talks about the tragedy of the flight of the Earls. Like, that's when the Gaelic Lords of Ireland left. Well, I think the whole greatest tragedy is that, like, the leaders like actually abandoned the Irish people. They left them. It was like the Highland clearances in Scotland as well. Like, loads of the Scottish lords or lairds or clan chiefs or whatever like that ended up cooperating with the system and fucking kicked off their own family members off the land because sheep were more profitable. And in Ireland's case with the flight of the Earls, like, the Gaelic lords and leaders like left the people completely leaderless, more or less. And the whole thing was, oh yeah, well, they were going over to Europe to get support and come back to Ireland, and it never worked out. Well, yeah, it never worked out. Like, I don't know how hard they tried. They just left. As far as the way I look at it, is that they just left the people like leaderless. They left their own people looking out for themselves. So you see in the 1500s which side you're on. You know what I mean? Both sides were using bagpipes. The Gaelic side were using them, and the English themselves were using them. You know, I just mentioned there several times that Henry VIII, like the father of Queen Elizabeth, he used Irish pipers himself. Like, so there, again, it's that like paradox of the piper. Like, you've got this old image of a piper basically standing for both sides of the coin. You know, the piper is used in both sides of this. So in the 1500s, that's why all these people were pardoned, because the whole thing that's annoying me is that, well, why were they pardoned unless they were arrested? Well, why were they arrested in the first place? What side were they on? And they were just, on the wrong side of the law, which at the time might have been happened to be the English side of the law, right? But it wasn't really that there was a law against bagpipers, because the English themselves were using Irish bagpipers, so the law wasn't against bagpipers. It was just about who you were loyal to. Because the English themselves at the time were using Irish pipers. Like, their allies in Ireland were playing pipes. They were over in England playing the bagpipes for them. So the law was not the bagpipe was the problem. It was like what side you were on. So then that's the 1500s. Then in the 1600s, it was like much actually more complicated than that. Like, you had three things going on now in the 1600s. Now it's not about who's the king, it's about who's in charge. Now, in fact, even before that, it's the ideas of religion. Like, we think we've got problems between Catholics and Protestants, right? They had all those same problems in England. In the 1500s, like, England wasn't completely Catholic, don't forget. England was still half Protestant. I mean, in the 1500s, this Protestantism was a new thing, and not everyone supported it. And into the 1600s, it was still the same thing. And, in the days of Queen Elizabeth I, mean, there was wars in England about Catholics versus Protestants. I mean, like, look at King James, like the Guy Fawkes. In the early 1600s, after Elizabeth died, I think she died in about 1602 or 1603, around that time. And then King James ascends the throne, who's Scottish for a start off. He's a Scotsman. So he's not even English. Like, so this whole thing about it's always England like versus Ireland. Well, hold on, our king was Scottish for the start since King James. But the thing about that was, like, the Roman Catholics wanted to blow him up and the Parliament to get Catholic power back. So even in England itself, in the 1600s, throughout the 1500s and into the 1600s, there were still Catholics, factions of Catholics wanting power back and wanting to restore a Catholic monarch back on the crown. So back on the throne, I should say. So so don't just think that this Catholic Protestant problem is an Irish English problem. It's not. It's not just an Irish problem. They had that in England, and then to compound that problem, even Protestants themselves. There's two kinds of Protestant in England, right now. So the original Protestants were under Henry VIII, which was just basically he chucked out the Pope and he puts himself head of the church, and very little changed. If you go to a Church of England service, or even Church of Ireland today, you'll see that there's very actually little difference between the Church of England service and a mass, Catholic mass. They say most of the same prayers and hymns and stuff like that, and they don't have the same objections to statues and stained glass and all those decorations and stuff like that. But then you had Presbyterianism or Calvinism, which was more Puritan. Like, it was more basically they call it like sola scriptura, like solely scripture. So if it's not in the Bible, it doesn't count. And they saw any hang up from Rome at all, including having the head of a church, whether that's a king or a pope, as out. Their view on it was there's only one king, and that's Christ. And everything that we need to know is in the Bible, and it's not man-made rules. It's just God's word is in the Bible. And they had a much more simplistic thing of getting rid of the wealth and the gold and the ornaments and the decorations and the fancy buildings and the power and all that. And their idea was much more simplistic, like simpler churches and a more basic kind of fundamental way of Christianity, way of life. And that sort of Presbyterianism, or if you want to call it Calvinism, or if you want to call it Puritanism in England, personified by Cromwell, that clashed with Church of England Protestants. Now you have two types of Protestantism that's happening. So I know this is like a story about history, but it falls into place is because who's playing the bagpipes during all these conflicts? Do you know what I mean? You could be playing for any sort of a force or any sort of a side. Now, by and large, a lot of these Presbyterians and Calvinists were Scottish, so they played bagpipes anyway, you see. And then there was a time when they were called like Covenanters, because I won't go into the whole thing, but there was a time when the Covenanters supported Cromwell because they saw it a bit more eye to eye religiously. They did. So the Scottish are playing bagpipes anyway. So this all compacts down into a civil war then that goes up and down the whole island of Britain and spills over into Ireland. Cromwell decides not just about religion, it's about that there shouldn't be a king at all. And then it's only Parliament that the people Parliament should rule and not the king should rule. So in the 1600s, it's much more layered and it's much more complex, that there's several kinds of conflict going on. There's still the remnants of Catholics in England. Ireland is still predominantly Catholic. Scotland is like sort of most of the Highland area, like Highlanders traditionally are considered Catholic. I know that's a bit real broad brushstrokes and it's not entirely true, but there's still Catholics in Scotland. There's still Catholics in England. Ireland is predominantly Catholic, apart from in Ulster. Then you've got two types of Protestantism on the island of Britain, where you've got like Church of England Protestantism, and then you have the newer, it's not newer, it's more it's Calvin. Like they're looking at like Calvin and Knox and Martin Luther and that Lutheranism as well. You have a more sort of, I hate to say severe or stricter, but a more sort of fundamental puritanical form of Protestantism that's not related to Church of England. So now you've got Catholics, you've got like two types of Protestant, right? Then you've got the idea of who should be governing you. Should it be a king or should it be a parliament? So when you look at the whole thing about what's going on, it's quite complex. And so there are pipers sort of on all sides. And it's just, as I say, who's in charge at the time, if it's the king, if it's the parliament. that's who decides what side you're on. You know, in the 1500s, there was more of a case of it was a little bit more simpler in Ireland, and that was just like you have this Gaelic system, the older system against the newer English/British system, and you had Irish pipers on both sides of that. But my God, 100 years later, it's much more complicated between different kinds of Protestants. Then you have Catholics, and then you have the conflict of the English Civil War over should it be a king or should it be a parliament. And there's pipers on all sides of this. So that's what I mean when I say like what side of the law you're on. It just doesn't really matter. What side of the law it is because like who is writing the law is like who was in charge at the time, and it kept changing who was in charge. I mean, that's why there was pipes played like when King James, like King Charles was restored. Charles II, like his father was executed by Cromwell. Half the English hated Cromwell. He despised Catholics anyway, so whatever Catholics were in England, he despised them. And he despised, well, I'm being real general now as well, but you know, loyalists to the king, he didn't like them either, you know, so that's what he dug him up, like, you know. And when he was in charge, like in the Commonwealth it was called at the time, like he was severe. The laws were severe about things, and you know, when he died, the people dug him up and hung him, and they returned the king, Charles II, whose father had been executed. And then Charles' son, you see, was James, and when James then there's a whole conflict over then that the English monarchy itself, there's a danger of it turning Catholic to the problem of, like, that's the way they saw that as being a problem. And so James had support in Ireland, and like sort of half of Scotland, and that's like there was bagpipers playing for him when he arrived, like, and you know, so you see, just to say that, guess what? The English banned the bagpipes in the statutes of Kilkenny in the 1300s is just completely so fucking wrong and basic and simple. The crime wasn't the bagpipe. The crime just was which wrong side out of a whole load of different sides did you happen to be on? Did you have the misfortune to be on? That's the whole thing of it. It's not the instrument. There was never a law that said from now on the bagpipes, no matter who's playing them or what they're doing or where they are or what side they're on or what religious persuasion they are or whether they believe in a king or whether they believe in the independence of Ireland or whether they believe in the Gaelic system or whether they believe in a union or whether they believe in Parliament and Cromwell and all. That's the, you know, there's to be no one playing the bagpipes at all. That is just simply not what happened. So I hope after all this time I could sum all that up with that is the complexity of what happened. The problem wasn't that you were playing a bagpipe. The problem was which of the numerous sides were you caught on? Were you caught out on with them in an act of rebellion against whatever was the opposing side, which there were so many sides and so many things changed in that 200 years. The power kept swapping from one group to another. So the bagpipe wasn't the problem. And when you even look at the basics bones of that statute of Kilkenny, it was never ever an outright blanket ban, and it never even succeeded. Like, even for what it did try to prohibit was spying from one court to another. That's all that was. So I hope we've summed it all up, that the bagpipes were never banned. There was never a law banning the bagpipes in Ireland.